Have you ever felt your lungs screaming for air, but when looking into the eyes of the one who birthed you, you only see annoyance and disgust? What happens when those supposed to protect you become a deadly threat you need rescuing from? Stay until the end, because you will understand why the most peaceful sound in the world is the click of a door closing forever. Hello and sincerely, welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating and paying our hardworking staff for their daily lives. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donate link in the description or comments below. My name is Lorelei Fleming, and I am 28 years old by day. I am a project manager at Lumina Core PR, a high-pressure media conglomerate where my entire job revolves around putting out fires and fixing disasters before they happen. By night, and on every single weekend for the past 6 months, I have been the unpaid event planner, caterer, and emotional punching bag for my younger sister, Clara. Tonight was her lavish engagement party, held at an obscenely expensive rented mansion out in the suburbs, and I was running on absolute fumes. I had been awake for 48 hours straight, single-handedly coordinating florists, wrangling musicians, and ensuring that Clara's future in-laws, a family of generational wealth who looked at us like we were dirt on their expensive shoes, were treated like absolute royalty. The kitchen of the mansion was a cavernous space of stainless steel and cold white marble, and it was my designated prison for the evening. I stood at the massive center island, my phone pressed between my shoulder and my ear as I fired off rapid responses to urgent work emails. At the exact same time, my hands were furiously arranging delicate hors d'oeuvres on a silver platter. I needed to ensure the spread was visually flawless before taking it out to the terrace for the guests. Next to the platter sat a crystal bowl of specialty cream sauce, a last-minute addition demanded by Clara. Without a second thought, I dipped a clean spoon into the bowl and brought it to my lips to test the seasoning. Just a tiny, insignificant drop on my tongue. It took exactly 4 seconds for my body to register that I had swallowed a literal poison. The physical reaction was not gradual. It was an explosive, violent ambush on my entire nervous system. First came the intense, burning itch at the back of my throat, followed immediately by a horrific, suffocating swelling sensation. It felt as though someone had shoved a rough tennis ball down my windpipe and was rapidly inflating it with a bike pump. My airway clamped shut tight. Panic, sharp and freezing, spiked through my chest. My fingers suddenly lost their grip. The heavy porcelain tasting plate slipped from my trembling hands and shattered into 100 jagged pieces against the hardwood floor. The sound was deafening, a sharp crash that echoed off the high ceilings, but I could barely hear it over the frantic, rushing pulse pounding in my own ears. I lunged forward, my fingernails digging desperately into the cold edge of the marble countertop. I opened my mouth, straining my neck upward, trying to drag a single breath of oxygen into my burning lungs. Nothing happened. No air passed, just a high-pitched, pathetic wheezing sound that vibrated painfully in my swollen chest. My eyes bulged, watering profusely as my face flushed dark red, then began to turn a sickly, terrifying shade of purple. I was suffocating. I was drowning on dry land, my lungs screaming for mercy, my mind spiraling into raw, primal terror. The heavy swinging door of the kitchen pushed open. It was my mother, Beatrice. She stepped in, draped in an elegant emerald gown, her posture stiff and her expression utterly bored. I locked eyes with her, begging her silently. My hand reached out in the air, trembling, pleading for help. I needed an ambulance. I needed an EpiPen. I needed my mother. Beatrice did not gasp. She did not rush forward to hold me. She simply stopped, looking down at the broken porcelain and then up at my purple, desperate face. Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Quit faking it. Get in the kitchen and clean up this mess," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. She stepped forward and deliberately used the sharp heel of her designer shoe to kick a jagged piece of the broken plate out of her path. She let out a heavy theatrical sigh, muttering loudly to the empty room about how I was always trying to ruin things, how I was always looking for a pathetic way to steal the spotlight on someone else's special day. I wanted to scream at her, but my vocal cords were sealed completely shut. The edges of my vision began to fray, dissolving into a fuzzy, encroaching blackness. The strength drained completely from my legs. My knees buckled, hitting the floor hard, and the cold marble counter slipped from my fingers. I was falling. I closed my eyes, preparing for the crushing impact of my skull against the hardwood, but the impact never came. Before I could hit the ground, the kitchen door burst open again. Large, calloused hands grabbed me tight, halting my fall just inches from the broken porcelain. It was Elias. We had only been dating for a short time, and bringing a firefighter to a high society event had already earned me endless scowls and whispers from my mother. Yet in that rapidly fading moment of consciousness, his strong arms wrapping around my collapsing body were the only things tethering me to the world of the living. Elias did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. His professional training as a first responder kicked in instantly, transforming him from a polite wedding guest into an authoritative force. He laid me flat on the cold kitchen tiles, his broad hands swiftly tilting my chin back to open whatever microscopic fraction of my airway remained. His eyes, usually warm and gentle, were narrowed with intense, clinical focus as he scanned my rapidly swelling face and neck. He instantly recognized the classic, terrifying signs of severe anaphylactic shock. "She is in full anaphylaxis," Elias barked, his voice carrying a booming, unmistakable command that cut right through the ambient noise of the party. He did not wait for Beatrice to respond. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, whipped out his phone, and dialed 911. Beatrice gasped, stepping forward with her hands firmly planted on her hips. "Put that phone away right now. I said she is just being dramatic. Do not you dare call an ambulance to this house and cause a scene. She is fine." Elias completely ignored her. "This is a medical emergency," he roared into the phone, his deep voice echoing out of the kitchen and spilling directly into the grand living room where the guests were mingling. "I have a 28-year-old female experiencing severe anaphylactic shock. Airway is closing rapidly. We need advanced life support at this location immediately. Estimated time of arrival needs to be under 5 minutes or she is going to code." Before dispatch could even confirm the address, the heavy kitchen doors swung open again. My father, Thomas, marched in. His face was flushed red with anger. A half-empty crystal glass of bourbon clutched in one hand. He took one look at the situation, me turning blue on the floor and Elias shouting instructions to a dispatcher, and his primary concern was not my survival. It was the social optics. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Thomas growled, tossing his glass onto the counter and lunging forward. He reached out, desperately trying to snatch the phone right out of Elias's hand. "Are you out of your mind? You are humiliating us in front of the Montgomery family. Hang up that phone right now before you ruin Clara's entire future." Elias did not flinch. With one fluid, powerful motion, he shoved my father backward. The force of the push sent Thomas stumbling several feet across the kitchen, his polished dress shoes slipping awkwardly on the marble floor. Elias immediately shifted his large, muscular frame, creating an impenetrable human shield between my struggling body and my parents. "Step back," Elias ordered, a dangerous, low warning in his tone. "If you touch me again, I will have the police arrest you for interfering with a medical rescue. She is dying. You absolute fools." He dropped to his knees again, keeping a firm grip on my jaw to keep my airway as straight as possible. He spoke to me quietly, urging me to stay awake, telling me to focus on his eyes. But my vision was swimming in a sea of gray shadows. The agonizing tightness in my chest was unbearable. I was slipping away, right there on the kitchen floor, while my parents stood just a few feet away, whispering furiously to each other about how to perform damage control with their wealthy guests. Less than 4 minutes later, The flashing red and white lights of the ambulance painted the mansion's massive front windows. Heavy boots pounded against the hardwood floors as two paramedics rushed into the house carrying a medical bag and a collapsible stretcher. As they burst into the kitchen, the entire party fell into a dead, horrifying silence. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly. The Montgomery family, Clara's obscenely wealthy future in-laws, stood frozen by the terrace doors, their mouths slightly parted in shock as they witnessed the absolute chaos unfolding. Instead of guiding the paramedics to her dying daughter, Beatrice spun around and stomped toward the front entrance, waving her arms frantically at the ambulance parked in the circular driveway. "Turn that hideous siren off immediately," Beatrice shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing across the manicured lawn. "Turn it off! You are completely ruining my symphony orchestra. Do you have any idea how much money I paid for that string quartet? You are destroying the aesthetic of the entire evening." The paramedics ignored her unhinged demands. They dropped beside me, quickly plunging an epinephrine auto-injector into my thigh and strapping a high-flow oxygen mask over my face. I felt a sharp pinch, followed by a sudden, violent rush of adrenaline as the medication hit my bloodstream. They hoisted me onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency and began wheeling me out through the grand foyer, right past the horrified gazes of the elite attendees. As they pushed me through the massive double doors, I managed to crack my swollen eyelids open just enough to see the grand staircase. Standing halfway up the steps was my sister, Clara. She was wearing a stunning, custom-made white gown that I had spent 3 weeks helping her design. I looked at her face, desperately searching for a single tear, a gasp of horror, or even a shred of sisterly concern for my life. There was nothing but pure, unadulterated fury. Her fists were clenched tight at her sides, her jaw locked. She glared at my stretcher not with fear for my survival, but with extreme anger because I had stolen the spotlight and ruined her perfect, expensive party. The paramedics loaded me into the back of the ambulance and slammed the heavy metal doors shut. The engine roared to life, and the loud, piercing wail of the sirens sliced through the quiet suburban night. As the vehicle sped down the long driveway, carrying me away from the mansion, a cruel, heavy truth finally settled into my oxygen-deprived brain. It was a realization far more painful than the physical agony in my throat. My family would have rather let me choke to death in total silence than suffer a single minute of social embarrassment. I slowly drifted back to consciousness, anchored to reality by a single, monotonous sound. Beep, beep, beep. The steady, rhythmic chime of the heart monitor next to my bed was the only tangible proof that I still existed. I blinked against the harsh, fluorescent lighting, my vision slowly coming into focus. I was in the intensive care unit. The room was a stark, sterile box of pristine white walls and brushed steel, smelling faintly of rubbing alcohol and bleached linens. It was undeniably cold in here. Yet as I lay utterly still beneath the thin, scratchy hospital blanket, a profound and unfamiliar sensation washed over me. It was peace. For the first time in what felt like 100 years, I was completely alone, enveloped in a quiet that was not demanding anything from me. I was not fixing a crisis. I was not managing a catastrophe. I was just breathing. A soft click broke the silence as a nurse stepped into the room. She had kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, checking my vitals with practiced, quiet movements. She noticed I was awake and offered a warm, albeit sympathetic, smile. "You gave us quite a scare, honey," she said softly, adjusting the intravenous drip attached to the back of my hand. "Your allergic reaction was incredibly severe. Your airway was almost completely restricted by the time they brought you through the doors. The attending physician said you were right on the absolute edge of cardiac arrest. If that ambulance had been delayed by even 3 or 4 minutes, we would have had to perform an emergency tracheotomy right there on the stretcher to save you. 3 or 4 minutes. That was the microscopic margin between my life and a violent, suffocating death." I nodded slowly, unable to speak, my throat still raw and bruised from the swelling, as the nurse quietly exited the room, leaving me alone with the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. I stared up at the blank ceiling and began to dissect the last decade of my life. I mentally laid out every memory, every sacrifice, every check I had written. I was the one who paid the overdue credit card bills when Beatrice maxed them out on designer clothes. I was the one who took out personal loans to cover the down payment on Thomas's failing business ventures. I was the meticulous maid who swept up the shattered pieces of Clara's dramatic tantrums. I was their human shield, their infinite bank account, their ultimate problem solver. But in the eyes of the Fleming family, I had never, not for a single second, been viewed as a human being who deserved to be loved. I was an appliance, and last night, when the appliance broke down and caused an inconvenience, they were perfectly willing to let it be thrown away in the garbage. Suddenly, the bright screen of my cell phone illuminated the dim bedside table. It buzzed aggressively, vibrating against the plastic tray. I reached over with a heavy, trembling arm and picked it up. It was a text message from my father. "You need to apologize to the in-laws immediately. Clara is crying her eyes out because you ruined everything." I stared at the glowing words. A year ago, a week ago, even 24 hours ago. A message like this would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and frantic apologies. I would have drafted a dozen different responses, begging for forgiveness for the crime of almost dying. But lying in that sterile room, staring at the cold, pixelated cruelty of his words, I felt absolutely nothing. No tears welled in my eyes. No familiar knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. There was only a vast, empty calm. With a slow, deliberate swipe of my thumb, I deleted the message. I set the phone face down on the table. The obedient, submissive, people-pleasing girl named Lorelei had not survived the night. She had suffocated and died on the cold floor of that rented mansion, taking her last desperate breath in the back of a screaming ambulance. The woman lying in this hospital bed was someone entirely different. The morning sun had barely begun to filter through the sterile blinds of my hospital room when the fragile peace I had finally found was violently shattered. It was barely 8 o'clock in the morning. The heavy wooden door did not just swing open. It was shoved inward with an aggressive, entitled force. Beatrice, Thomas, and Clara marched into the private intensive care unit like a heavily armed invading force. I noticed immediately that Beatrice had a laminated staff identification badge clipped to the lapel of her tailored blazer. It clearly belonged to an old acquaintance of hers who worked in hospital administration. A neat, corrupt little trick she used to effortlessly bypass the strict no-visitors policy the nurses had explicitly put in place for my recovery. They did not approach my bed with hushed voices or worried expressions. There were no tears of relief, no frantic questions about whether I was in severe pain or if my breathing had finally stabilized. Beatrice marched straight to the side of my bed, her heels clicking sharply and arrogantly against the linoleum floor. She reached into her expensive leather handbag, pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper, and tossed it carelessly onto my lap. It landed right on top of my thin hospital blanket. "Sit up and read that," Beatrice commanded, her voice sharp and entirely devoid of maternal warmth. "You need to memorize it quickly. We do not have all day to deal with this." I stared down at the paper, then back up at her, my expression completely blank. I did not reach for it. "It is a script," she continued, rolling her eyes in deep irritation at my absolute silence. "It was drafted by your father on the drive over here. You are going to take your phone, record a video of yourself looking appropriately apologetic, and post it to all of your social media accounts immediately. You are going to tag Clara, tag the Montgomery family, and explicitly state that your little fainting episode last night was a severe panic attack brought on by the immense pressure of your job at Luminacore Public Relations. You will make it 100% clear to the public that it had absolutely nothing to do with the catering, the venue, or the food served at the engagement party." I remained perfectly still, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor providing the only response to her absurd, callous demand. Clara pushed past our father and stepped right up to the edge of my bed. She was wearing massive dark sunglasses indoors, likely to hide the fact that she had not shed a single genuine tear over my near-death experience. She dramatically ripped the glasses off her face and began her theatrical performance. "Do you have any idea what you have done to me?" Clara shrieked, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. She stomped her foot on the floor like a petulant toddler. The Montgomery family left before the champagne tower was even poured. Mrs. Montgomery looked at me like we were a family of diseased peasants. You just could not stand the fact that someone else was getting married before you. Could you? You had to put on this massive guy's pathetic medical theater just to drag the spotlight back onto yourself. You ruined the most important night of my entire life because you are a jealous, bitter spinster. Thomas crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. "Your sister is exactly right," he chimed in, his tone dripping with heavy disappointment. "We spent over $50,000 on that venue and the catering. You embarrassed us in front of the most influential people in this entire city. The absolute least you can do to make up for this catastrophic, humiliating mess is record the damn video and take the blame. Be a team player for once in your miserable life and fix this." They stood there, a united front of pure toxicity, waiting for my usual reaction. For 28 years, this was the exact moment in the cycle where I would break. I would normally start crying. I would apologize profusely. I would pick up the piece of paper, my hands shaking with severe anxiety, and do exactly what they demanded just to make the screaming stop. I would absorb their blame like a sponge to keep the family peace. But this time, I did nothing. I did not cry. I did not yell back. I did not try to defend myself or explain that my airway had swollen completely shut and I was seconds away from a body bag. I simply let the silence stretch out, heavy and suffocating. I looked at Beatrice, then at Clara, and finally at Thomas. My eyes were entirely hollow, devoid of any fear, guilt, or submission. It was a cold, dead stare, the exact kind of look you give to a stray dog that you have zero intention of feeding. The total absence of my usual panic deeply unnerved them. I watched as Thomas subconsciously shifted his weight and actually took a half step backward, clearly disturbed by the unfamiliar, glacial void in my expression. Beatrice opened her mouth to snap at me again, her face reddening with fresh anger at my silent defiance. Before she could utter a single syllable, a deep, resonant voice echoed from the far corner of the room. "Please, do not stop on her account. Keep going." All three members of the Fleming family whipped their heads around in pure, unadulterated shock. In the shadowy corner of the hospital room, partially obscured by a heavy privacy curtain, sat Elias. He had been there all night long. He had absolutely refused to leave my side, sitting awake in an uncomfortable vinyl chair while I slept off the heavy medical sedatives. He slowly stood up, his massive, imposing frame unfolding from the shadows. His face was a mask of cold, highly controlled fury. In his right hand, he held his cell phone elevated at shoulder height. The screen was bright and facing outward, displaying a large red timer that was steadily counting upward, 3 minutes and 12 seconds. He had been recording the entire time. "I want to make sure I get every single word of this on tape," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm as he stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light, keeping the camera lens pointed directly at my parents. "I want a crystal clear, high-definition record of you demanding that your daughter, who nearly died from anaphylactic shock less than 12 hours ago, lie to the public to cover up your psychotic vanity. I am sure the Montgomery family will find this footage absolutely fascinating." The transformation in the room was instant and catastrophic. The arrogant, demanding posture of the Fleming family collapsed like a flimsy house of cards in a hurricane. Beatrice's jaw dropped open, the blood draining completely from her face until she looked as pale as the hospital sheets beneath me. Clara let out a sharp, genuine gasp of horror, instinctively raising both of her hands to cover her face from the camera lens as if it were a loaded weapon. Thomas stood completely paralyzed, his eyes wide with the terrifying realization that their carefully curated, flawless public image was suddenly in the hands of a blue-collar firefighter who utterly despised them. The heavy, oppressive mask of their psychological manipulation had just been violently ripped off. And for the very first time in my entire life, they were the ones who were absolutely terrified. The suffocating tension in the hospital room had reached a critical breaking point. Elias stood his ground, the digital timer on his phone screen brightly ticking upward, recording every single ounce of the Fleming family's sudden, terrified paralysis. Beatrice was hyperventilating, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water, desperately trying to formulate a sentence that could somehow erase the last 3 minutes of audio. Thomas was frozen in place, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead as the realization of his ruined public image crashed down upon him. Before any of them could attempt to snatch the phone or beg for mercy, the heavy door to the intensive care unit swung wide open. The attending physician, Dr. Sterling, strode into the room. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s with sharp, analytical eyes and a demeanor that commanded absolute, unquestionable authority. He wore a crisp white coat over his scrubs and carried a thick, blue medical chart clipped to a digital tablet. He immediately noticed the crowded room, the raised phone in Elias's hand, and the palpable, toxic atmosphere. But his professional focus remained entirely on me. "I see you have an audience," Dr. Sterling noted, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that echoed off the sterile walls. "However, I need to discuss your emergency toxicology and immunology reports. Lorelei, the results from your blood panels just came back from the priority lab, and they require immediate attention." My father, Thomas, immediately saw an opportunity to hijack the narrative and save face. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest and attempting to plaster on his usual arrogant business smile. "Doctor, thank goodness you are here," Thomas interrupted smoothly, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "Please tell this stubborn girl that she simply suffered a massive panic attack from her corporate job. My wife and I have been trying to explain to her that there is absolutely no way the luxury catering at our event caused this. The kitchen was strictly vetted for allergens." Dr. Sterling stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head slowly, fixing my father with a look of such intense, clinical disdain that it actually made Thomas take a step back. "Excuse me, sir," the doctor said, his tone dropping an octave, turning razor-sharp and uncompromising. "I am a board-certified immunologist and an emergency trauma physician. I do not deal in panic attacks, and I certainly do not deal in catering excuses. I deal in hematology and biological facts, and the biological facts printed right here in this report are deeply disturbing." The entire room fell into a dead, absolute silence. The rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor seemed to amplify, echoing loudly as everyone waited for the physician to continue. Dr. Sterling tapped the screen of his tablet, his expression turning incredibly grim. "Lorelei," he said, turning his attention back to me, his voice softening just a fraction for his patient. "When the paramedics brought you in, your airway was 95% closed. We ran a full immunoassay to determine the exact trigger of the anaphylaxis. Given your medical history, we tested specifically for walnut proteins. What we found in your blood serum completely rules out any possibility of accidental cross-contamination." Beatrice let out a sharp, audible gasp, her manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. Dr. Sterling did not look at her. He kept his eyes locked on mine, delivering the absolute truth with the heavy, undeniable weight of modern science. In a standard case of accidental exposure, say, a chef using a knife on a walnut salad and then using that exact same knife to prepare your food, we would expect to see a trace amount of the allergen in your system. A minute fraction of a milligram is enough to trigger a reaction, but your blood work showed something entirely different, something I have rarely seen outside of intentional ingestion. He paused, letting the silence stretch out to ensure every single person in the room understood the gravity of his next words. "The concentration of the walnut allergen protein in your bloodstream was astronomically high," the doctor stated firmly. "This was not a microscopic trace. This was a massive, concentrated dose. You did not just eat food that brushed against a walnut. You ingested pure, unadulterated walnut oil. It was poured directly into whatever you consumed right before your collapse. Elias took a slow, deliberate step forward from the corner of the room. He did not lower his phone. The red recording dot continued to blink, capturing every single second of this medical revelation. The only thing she consumed was a spoonful of a specialty cream sauce, Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that filled the sterile room. A sauce that was kept strictly in the private kitchen, a kitchen that only the catering manager and the host family had access to before the party started. Elias slowly turned the camera lens directly onto my mother. Is not that right, Beatrice? You were the only person in that kitchen with her before she collapsed. You were the one who demanded she taste that specific bowl. Beatrice was completely trapped. She was caught between the unyielding, objective scientific proof held by the doctor and the unforgiving, high-definition lens of Elias's recording device. Her meticulously crafted facade of high society elegance shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for an exit, looking for an excuse, looking for anyone to save her, but her narcissistic brain simply could not process the fact that she was cornered. Under the crushing, suffocating pressure, she completely broke down. "It was not supposed to do that," Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking into an ugly, hysterical pitch as she threw her hands out in front of her. The confession tore out of her throat like a trapped animal escaping a cage. The sheer panic overrode whatever remaining sense of self-preservation she had left. I just added a few drops of organic walnut extract to her specific tasting bowl, she babbled frantically, tears of absolute terror streaming down her face, completely ruining her expensive makeup. The label said it was refined. I did not know it would shut her entire throat down and send her to the hospital. Dr. Sterling stiffened, his professional composure momentarily giving way to profound, unadulterated shock. He stared at the woman in front of him, registering the fact that he had just walked into a confession for attempted murder. Elias took another step closer, his camera aimed right at her trembling face. "Why?" he demanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "Why would you intentionally poison your own daughter?" Beatrice sobbed, her answer exposing the absolute, rotting core of her sick, twisted soul. "I just wanted her to get a mild rash so she would have to go home early," she wailed, waving her hands defensively. The custom dress she was wearing was completely inappropriate. It was far too eye-catching and glamorous, and I did not want her standing next to Clara and ruining the aesthetic in the professional family photos. She always tries to outshine everyone else. The silence that followed her confession was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The air was entirely sucked out of the room. It was a silence so profound and absolute that I could hear the faint humming of the fluorescent lights above us. Even my father and sister were utterly paralyzed. Clara dropped her expensive designer handbag, the heavy metal clasp hitting the floor with a loud, jarring thud. She stared at our mother with wide, horrified eyes, her jaw hanging slack. Thomas gripped the edge of a nearby medical cart, his knuckles turning completely white. They were deeply selfish, manipulative people, but even they recognized the horrifying boundary between being a terrible parent and being a violent, calculating criminal. The realization that Beatrice had intentionally poisoned me over a photograph, over a dress, made them look at her with raw, unfiltered disgust. For the first time in my entire existence, I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no desire to ask why she hated me so much. The emotional tether that had bound me to this toxic family for 28 years simply snapped, severing cleanly and permanently. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I reached my hand over to the plastic rail of the hospital bed and firmly pressed my thumb down on the large red nurse call button. A voice crackled immediately over the intercom speaker above my bed. "Yes, Lorelei? Do you need assistance?" I looked directly into Beatrice's terrified, weeping eyes. My voice was no longer the soft, accommodating tone of the obedient daughter. It was sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Yes," I answered clearly, ensuring the intercom caught every word. I need hospital security up to the intensive care unit immediately. I also need you to contact the local police department, Beatrice gasped, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the wall. Lorelei, no, please, you cannot do this. It was a mistake. It was just a stupid mistake. I turned my head away from her and looked up at the attending physician. Dr. Sterling, I said, my voice as hard and unyielding as solid ice. You heard her confession, and we have it entirely captured on video. I am officially pressing criminal charges against this woman for intentional assault and poisoning. Within 60 seconds, the heavy doors burst open again. 3 burly, uniformed hospital security guards charged into the room, their expressions hardened and ready for an altercation. Dr. Sterling immediately pointed a stern finger at my mother, ordering the guards to remove her from the premises and detain her for law enforcement. Beatrice completely lost her mind. As 2 of the large guards grabbed her by the arms, she began kicking, thrashing, and screaming at the top of her lungs. Her expensive blazer ripped at the shoulder seam as she fought against their grip, her designer heels scuffing wildly against the pristine linoleum floor. "You ungrateful brat!" she shrieked, the sound echoing violently down the sterile hospital corridor as they forcefully dragged her backward out of the room. "I am your mother. You cannot do this to me. You are ruining everything." I lay perfectly still against my pillows, listening to the chaotic, pathetic sounds of her screams growing fainter and fainter as she was hauled away toward the elevators. The heavy wooden door swung shut on its automatic hinges, clicking firmly into place. The room returned to its quiet, sterile peace, leaving only Elias, the doctor, and the stunned, terrified remnants of my former family standing in the absolute wreckage of their own making. 2. Exactly measured days later, the hospital officially discharged me. I walked out through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby and stepped onto the warm concrete sidewalk. For a long, quiet moment, I simply stood there and closed my eyes. I took a massive, deep breath of the crisp morning air, pulling it all the way down to the very bottom of my lungs. They expanded perfectly, strong and healthy, completely free from the suffocating venom that had nearly destroyed them. But more importantly, my spirit felt completely untethered. The massive, crushing burden I had carried on my shoulders for my entire life was entirely gone. When Elias drove me back to my quiet, peaceful apartment, I finally turned my personal cell phone back on. The screen immediately lit up, buzzing continuously for almost 5 straight minutes as a massive flood of delayed notifications poured in. There were well over 100 missed calls and dozens of frantic, unhinged voicemails. I did not need to answer a single one of them to know exactly what had transpired while I was recovering in the intensive care unit. The local police had formally charged Beatrice with felony assault, and in the wealthy, elite circles of our city, vicious gossip travels faster than the speed of light. The Montgomery family had found out about the arrest before the sun even set on the day of the disastrous party. Unsurprisingly, they were absolutely horrified. A family built on generational wealth and a pristine public image wanted absolutely nothing to do with a psychotic woman facing severe prison time for attempting to murder her own flesh and blood over a photograph. They immediately canceled the entire engagement. The extravagant wedding was called off, the massive deposits were completely forfeited, and Clara was unceremoniously dumped, left alone to deal with the catastrophic social fallout of our mother's insane, criminal vanity. I listened to exactly one voicemail from my father. "Thomas." His voice was trembling as he begged me to drop the criminal charges and bail Beatrice out of a holding cell because the scandal was completely destroying his fragile business contacts. The next voicemail was from Clara, screaming and sobbing hysterically that her perfect life was over, blaming me for the fact that her wealthy fiancé had blocked her number and returned the engagement ring via a private courier. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not shed a single tear for their self-inflicted misery. I calmly pressed delete, erasing their voices from my phone and my mind. Later that afternoon, I sat in the polished oak conference room of a top-tier corporate lawyer. Together, we drafted ironclad, legally binding cease and desist orders directed specifically at every single member of the Fleming family. The extensive legal documents outlined severe, immediate consequences if they ever attempted to contact me, approach my private residence, or set foot anywhere near the corporate headquarters of Luminacore Public Relations under any circumstances. Once the heavy paperwork was signed and officially stamped, I began the digital purge. I went through every single social media platform, every email account, and every messaging application on my smartphone. I blocked Clara. I blocked Thomas. I blocked Beatrice. I deleted entire photo albums and completely erased every digital footprint tying me to their toxic, exhausting existence. I did not send a dramatic final text message. I did not demand closure or a pathetic apology. There were no screaming matches or tearful final confrontations. I realized then that the absolute most devastating, brutal revenge I could possibly inflict upon narcissistic people was to simply deprive them of my existence. I starved them of their favorite punching bag. When I returned to my apartment, I found Elias in my bedroom, carefully helping me pack a large suitcase. We were leaving the city for a long, quiet vacation to the coast, far away from the noise, the reporters, and the drama. He smiled at me, a warm, genuine smile that made my chest feel lighter than it had in 28 years. Before we drove to the airport, I asked Elias to pull his truck over in front of the local post office. I stepped out onto the quiet sidewalk, holding 3 thick certified mail envelopes containing the cease and desist orders. The late afternoon sun was shining brilliantly, casting a warm golden glow over the empty street. I walked straight up to the heavy blue collection box. I did not hesitate. I did not look back. I slipped the envelopes into the metal slot one by one. I pushed the handle up, and the heavy metal door swung shut with a loud, satisfying click. It was, without a doubt, the most beautiful, peaceful sound in the entire world. It was the sound of a door closing forever on the darkest chapter of my life. I smiled, a genuine expression of absolute relief, and walked back toward the car, leaving the Fleming family behind to completely destroy themselves in the cold, miserable shadows of their own making. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for staying with me and listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found my journey compelling and want to support the channel, please consider donating just $1 single. You can easily scan the QR code currently on your screen, or click the donation link provided in the description box and the pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helping them support their families while we continue to create and share more amazing stories with you. Thank you again, and take care.